This is a video to demonstrate the use of an array. Arrays are incredibly useful in programming when you want to store collections of data. So quite often you want to store data that's related. So for example, let's say we were gathering a student's exam marks. Rather than store each of these marks individually in a separate variable, it would make more sense if we could just store them in one single container. And that's where arrays come in. Arrays allow us to do this as long as each item of data we want to store is of the same type. So in other words, they would all need to be integers or characters or floats. They all have to be the same data type to belong in the single collection. So I'm just going to start this app by creating some text boxes to allow the user to enter some exam marks. So I'm just going to call this first one Mark 1 and clear the text out of it because we don't want to leave the text in there. Now one of the useful things you can do, you can actually Control C and Control V items. So I now have 4 boxes here. They're all on top of each other, so we've got to be careful and drag them off. There we are. So now I need to make sure I go and name each one of them. So that one's already called TXT Mark 1. This one I'm going to call TXT Mark 2. And no surprise, this is going to be Mark 3. And then the final one will be Mark 4. Okay. Right, so I'm going to put a wee label at the top to explain to the user what it is they're actually doing here. That's important. Make sure your apps are always usable, so they've got instructions on them so the user knows what they're doing. So please enter your marks in the boxes below. Right, how does that look? We can make that a wee bit bigger, so I'm going to increase the text to 20. How does that look? Yep, that's fine. Oh, I don't particularly want it to be at an angle. Oops. There we are. Okay, let's just move this across to the middle a bit. You can play around with the formatting, that's the easy bit. So please enter your marks in the boxes below. I'm then going to add a button here that allows them to display their marks. So I'm going to call that BTN display. So this is going to display whatever marks they entered. I'm going to increase that size to 20 as well. And change it to say display marks. Okay, and then I'm going to add in a text block here where we can actually show the marks that have been entered. So text block here, and this is going to be called BLK marks because it's just going to display the list of marks. And again, I'm going to change the size to 20. Oh, and let's remove this annoying word. So go to the text property and delete it. So the text block is there, it's just you can't see it unless you're hovering over it. The next thing I'm going to do is add a button here to display the total. So I'm going to call this BTN total. And I'll just say on it display total. Okay. And obviously I'm going to need a text block to then display that value in. So I'm going to call that BLK total. Excellent. And take that text block word out. So you can worry it doesn't look particularly nice, not everything's not perfectly aligned, but that's the easy bit afterwards. You can fiddle around with how it all looks. The key thing here is we're trying to learn about the exam marks. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have to get the marks out the text boxes and add them into the array. So I really need to include a button here to add the marks. So let's do that, to enter the marks so they actually get added to the array. So let's call this one btn add marks. Change it to 20 like the rest, and I'm just going to call the button enter marks, or put the label enter marks on the button. And that'll be a bit bigger. So you can play around with the layout, as I said. So at the moment, my intention is the user enters a value in each text box and then clicks on enter marks. Once we've done that, they can then display the marks again, or they can display the total. So let's first of all deal with entering the marks. So let's double click on that button to create an event handler. So the first thing we need in our code is we need to set up an array to store all the marks. Now, I would like this array containing all the marks to be available to every single item on the window. So for that reason, it means that I need to create it within the class, so it's available to everything in the main window class. But I don't want to create it inside an event handler. If I create the array inside an event handler, then it's only available to that one item, so that one element. In this case, it would only be available to that button, but I want all of the different items on the window to be able to see the array. So I'm going to create it up the top. I'm going to have the array storing integers, so whole numbers, so the exam marks have to be whole numbers. So it's going to be an integer, and it's an array. So immediately after the data type, I put in the square brackets. So that immediately tells it it's not just one integer, it's a collection of integers. I then need to give it a label. So I'm just going to call it exam marks because that makes sense. And then I need to actually create it in memory. So I'm going to say int exam marks new array of integers size, oh no, not 5, it was 4. Okay, so that's us done the first part. We've created an empty array ready to store the marks. Okay, so we've created an array in memory. It can store integers, it can store up to 4 integers, and it's got a label on it called exam marks. So when the user clicks on add, what we want to do is we want to go to each of the text boxes. Now we're just going to keep this nice and simple, and we want to grab the data out the text box and put it into the array. So how do we put an item into the array? Well, we need to use the label in order to access the array. So that's the label here. So let's use the label exam marks. Now the label would give us the whole array. We need to put our data into a particular slot inside the array. So immediately after the label, inside square brackets, we put the index of where we want to store our data. So I'm going to put the first text box at index 0. So I'm going to say at index 0 of the array, I want you to put in mark1 text box dot text. Now this is going to come up as an error. The problem we have, remember, is anything that comes out of a text box is by default a string. So we're going to have to, once we grab this value, we're going to have to convert it to an integer. And we've seen this a lot when dealing with text boxes, so this should be familiar to you. So in front of the bit of data, we say int.parse, which basically means reading it right to left to get the text out of the text box called txt mark1. So that's this text box here, txt mark1, convert it into an integer and store it in the array. And then we just basically repeat that for the other values out the text boxes, this time putting them in obviously the next location. So mark2 is going to go into index 1. So again, int.parse txt mark2. And then next slot is index 2. Oh, I've ended up a bracket in. Oh, a bracket from here. Oops. txt mark3. And then finally the last one, goes into txt mark 4. Perfect. Okay, so that's us now added all of our exam marks into this array. So what that means we can now do is, we can now, when we click on this display button, we can now go to that array and display whatever's inside it. Similarly, when we click on the display total button, again we can go to that array and add up the contents and display the result. So let's go and do that now. So let's click on display marks is the next one we're going to do. So for the display, what we're going to do is basically grab each mark out of the array and add it to the text block. So there's a couple of ways we could do this. So let's first of all start off with the text block. So text block is called BLK marks. We want to update the text property, and we want to basically say put in the exam marks at index 0. Now again, because it's an integer, we need to convert it back to a string in order to put it in the text block, which is very frustrating. Plus, let's say we put in a comma. Then we want to put in the second exam mark, so exam marks 1. Again, need to convert it to a string. Plus, again, a comma. So you can see this is quite long. And then the next one in the array, which is at index 2. Remember, once we get it out the array, convert it to a string. Plus another comma. Plus the last one is exam marks 3. Oh, off the end of the page there. To string. Okay, so that's quite a long statement. It's very repetitive, and that works fine. So that basically says add whatever's at index 0 to the text block, then a comma, then whatever's at index 1, then a comma, then whatever's at index 2, then a comma, then whatever's at index 3. Now that's fine when you've only got an array with 4 items in it, but can you imagine if we were storing a collection of 100 or 1,000? It's just not going to be possible or practical to build up the text block like this. So what we can do instead is we could actually use a for loop, because effectively we're doing a repetitive action. We're basically saying for every item inside the array, add it into the text block. So let's set up a for loop to do that for us instead. So remember, your for loop's got the for keyword, body of the for. Now let's go and fill in the for loop. So the first thing we need to do is set up a counter, and the counter is going to be initialized to 0. The reason why it's starting at 0 is because that counter is what we are going to use as our index for the array, and remember, array indexes start at 0. We want to go through, and we want to, every time round, we want to update the counter by 1, so counter plus plus. So the first time round the loop will be 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, and so on. Now in the middle, remember, we need our test condition. So every time round the loop, what are we checking? Well, we want to keep going round the loop as long as we've not reached the end. So while we've not reached the last item, we need to keep going to get the next item out. So we want to basically say, every time round, we're going to test the counter and make sure the counter is less than the length of the array. So array name dot length. So remember, if we want to find something out about the array, we use its name and then the dot, and then we can get a list of things that we can ask it. And one of the things we can ask it is its length. So this is saying we're going to keep going round the array, starting at index 0. Every time round, we're going to check that we're still less than the length, so we've still not reached the end of the array, and we'll update the counter. So we move on to the next item. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking the text block and we're going to be updating it. Now remember, when we add items to a text block, every time we add something new, then we have to keep what's already there. If we don't, then it'll overwrite it. It's okay in this scenario here because we're adding everything at once, but because in the for loop we're adding things one bit at a time, it means that effectively as we add new things to the text block, it'll overwrite what's already there. So to keep what's already there, we say update the text block to be whatever's already there plus the new thing. So what is the new thing? Well, the new thing is the value out of the array. So the next mark in the array. So to access the array name, and then the index. And as I mentioned, the index is the counter in this case. So the first time round the array, the counter's 0. So it's going to update the text block to keep what's already there, and then it's going to add on whatever is in the exam marks index at index 0. So the very first item. It's then going to update the count back around the loop, update the counter to 1. It's going to come in here, it's going to keep what's already there, and then add the next exam mark at index 1, and so on. Now I'm just having a wee think. We want to put a comma in to separate them as well. So let's not forget to do that. Or we could just put in a bit of white space actually, that would work absolutely fine. So let's just in here add in a bit of white space. There we go, that'll do fine. Now the text block initially should be empty, but let's just make sure it is. So at the top of our loop, let's just update the text block to be an empty string. There we go. Just to make sure. Okay, right, so let's save that. Now we could actually test this at this stage. So we've got the ability to add the marks and the ability to display them. So let's run it and just check that that actually works. Once you've written a for loop to go through an array, it's the same for every single for loop you write. So once you understand how to do it, you're doing the same thing each time. So let's say I'm adding in my values, 10, 20, 30, 40, enter marks. So behind the scenes, what should be happening is those marks should be entered into the array. So now when I click on the display, yeah, they've been entered. So we can see that they're in there. Now, got some strange behaviour here. 20, 10, 30, 40, 20. Okay, so it's adding it twice. Right, let's have a wee look and figure it. Oh, of course it is, because I've kept in both methods. So I've got the method of adding it all at one go, and I've got the for loop. So obviously we don't need both of those. So let's just keep the for loop. So let's stop that, and I'll comment this one out so that doesn't run anymore, and we'll just use the for loop method. Because as I said, this is fine as long as you've got a few items, but as soon as you've got a massive amount of items in your array, then it's not practical to put it all in one line. The other things I noticed were that once we added the marks were still in the text boxes, so it'd be quite nice to maybe pop up a message box to confirm to the user the marks have been added. So let's do that. So go back to the add button. So after it's added the marks, I'm going to also pop up a message box to say marks have been added, because we've got to think about the user and what their thoughts are. And then once we've said that, let's go and empty the text boxes. So mark 1 dot. So to empty text boxes, we can just use the text box name and then the clear behaviour. So that basically says go to that text box and clear out anything that's in it. And we'll just do the same for all of these. Alternatively, what you could do, if you can't remember this behaviour, then you can just say update the text to be an empty string. That does exactly the same thing. So I'll leave that in like that just so you can see that too. So two ways of doing it. Okay, right, that looks a bit nicer. So let's run it again and see if that looks a bit more usable. So you should always be evaluating as you're creating your app. So let's say 10, 20, 30, 40. Enter marks. So marks have been added. That's a bit nicer. Now I can do the display, and there they are. There, that looks not too bad. Okay, let's now work on the last button, which is the display total. So double click so we can create an event handler. I'm double clicking, not working there. There we go, wasn't fast enough. Okay, so in here we are going to this time go around the array, getting each mark just like we've done up here. So we'll use the for loop again, exactly the same for loop, but this time when we get the mark, instead of displaying it a text block, we are going to use the mark to add to our total because we want to display our total. So we want to display a total, so let's first of all set up a variable to display the total, and we'll initialize it to 0. It's a whole number, so it's an int, call it total because that makes sense, and we'll set it to 0. This is green just now because we've set up a variable that we're not using, but we're about to use it in a second. So again, for loop, so we can literally use the same for loop because we're going round the same array. So this is what this for loop does. This for loop on its own just simply goes round the array, starting at index 0 all the way up to the end of the array. So this time I want to calculate the total. So total is going to be equal to, each time round I'm going to add on the next mark. So I want to keep the total that's already there and just add on the next mark. So each time round the loop I'm getting another mark out of the array and I'm adding that to the total. So I'm saying the total needs to be updated to be whatever the current total is plus the next mark from the array. So the next mark from the array is exam marks and then the index to access the array. So the first time round the loop, counter is 0, so the total will be the current total, which initially will be 0, plus whatever is at the array at index 0. It'll then go back round the loop, the counter will be updated to 1. It'll do the test, 1 is still less than the length, so we're not at the end of the array yet. So it'll come back in here and it'll say take the total. So for the values I entered, my first mark entered was 10, so the total is currently sitting at 10. So it'll say take the total, update it with what the current total is, which is 10, plus the next item, this time at index 1. So that would be 20. So the total would now be 30. Background the loop and so on. Remember, the key thing is that when you, if you're not sure of what to do, remember stick the debugger on. So if you want to see how the loop works, just stick a breakpoint into the wee grey column and then run your program and you can actually follow it through. It's really helpful for things like that. Okay, right, let's see. So once we've done that, why am I got a... Oh, it looks like I'm missing a bracket somewhere here. Oh, I must have deleted one. The other thing that's really useful is you'll notice with these, see these lines kind of join up the brackets. So if you get like a bracket being underlined and it tells you you're missing a bracket, make sure your lines connect from bracket to bracket. So you can see here, this dotted line's not connecting to anything. So I must have accidentally removed a bracket. So put it back in, bingo, gone, and the lines join up again. So once we've done the total, after the end of this loop, the total will be calculated, so we then need to put it into the text block. So remember, we created a text block here, there it is, called BLK total. So we're going to say, go to BLK total, oops, and update the text to be the value of the total. Now this is going to be underlined. Think why? Because total is an integer, text block is a string. So again, we've got to do that annoying conversion to put it into the text block. Right, okay, so that's saying take the total, convert it to a string and put it in the text block. So let's say save that, run it again. See how we go on. Bring it onto my screen. So let's see, 10, 20, 30, 40, enter the marks. Marks have been added. If I want to display them, I can. Want to display the total, there we go. 10 and 20 is 30, 30 and 30 is 60, 60 and 40 is 100, so that's correct. So that's pretty nice. Other things we could do, we could obviously improve the GUI. So at this point, the user might want to actually put in another set of marks. So it might be quite nice to have a clear button so we can clear out what's currently here so they can run it again. So let's just, why don't we just add in a clear button? And these are all things that as you're developing, you can think about, obviously not just about getting it working, but what the user would like. So I've added another button. I'm going to call it BTN Clear. Put it up to the same size as the rest, and I'm just going to say clear on it. So this is going to be the clear button. Now we've already got, once we add the exam marks, that clears out the text boxes. The only things we really need to clear using the clear button, or I suppose we could just clear everything just to be safe. So let's clear all 4 text boxes and these 2 text blocks. That would be the most sensible thing to do. So mark 1 dot clear, and I'm just going to copy and paste this just for speed. 2, 3, 4. So we need to clear text box 2, text box 3, text box 4. Perfect. And then we've got the 2 blocks. So block marks dot clear. Oh, is it clear value? Clear value instead of just clear. I'm not convinced about using that. Okay. So let's just say update the text to be blank, just to make sure it actually does what we expect. And total is the other one, so update the text in that one just to be an empty string. There. So again, that's another nice wee bit of usability. So run it again. So this is iterative development. We're changing things and we're updating things as we go along. But notice how I'm only ever doing one bit of implementation before a test, because you don't want to do everything and then test and have lots of errors. There, that's nice, and then you can do it again. So that looks a lot better. Now, I guess, let me just stop this running to show you another thing that would potentially be an issue. So let's drag this across. When we enter marks, let's just say the user's been a bit misbehaved and they go straight for display marks and display total. So there's no marks entered, so you get zeros, which is okay because there's nothing being entered. But we could actually take this one stage further, and this is the last thing I'll add in this video. We do have the ability to enable and disable these buttons. So it'll be quite smart if we could disable these buttons so that the user can't use them until they've actually entered some valid marks. So that'd be quite a smart thing to be able to do. So let's go and see if we can do that. So the first thing we need to do is when the window loads, remember the constructor is the one that runs when the page loads, the window loads, we want to disable those buttons. Now, what are the buttons called again? BTN display, yep. And it's got a property called isEnabled. So by default it is enabled, and we're going to set it equal to false. Oh, is it just like that? I can't remember now. Yeah, there we go. And then the other one is BTN total, and it's got a property called isEnabled, and we're going to set that to false as well. So now when we run this, you'll see that those buttons are disabled. There we go, see we can't click on them, so that's nicer. We want to leave the clear button because if they do type stuff in, we want them to be able to clear it. Right, that's fine, but now the next step is after they've entered values and clicked on enter marks, as soon as they click on enter marks, we need to enable these so that they can then use them. So we need to go to the enter marks event handler, which is this one here, and we need to enable the buttons at the end. So at the end of this, once we know they've added stuff and it's been added into the array, we can then change the display button as enabled property now can be true, and same for the total. can now be true. So that's a nice wee addition. Let's run it again. Okay, so I can't click on anything, but as soon as I add some marks, enter marks, marks have been added. There we are, they're both able to be used. Okay, that brings us to the conclusion of this wee app, guys. The main purpose is really to help you to understand how to set up an array. So in your activity for the class this week, you're going to be shown how to set up an array with an initial set of values. That's why I've done this video, because this shows you how to set up an empty array and then add values into it. So now you'll get to see how to do both sides. You're also getting shown how to access individual items in the array using the indexes, and then very importantly how to use a for loop to help you go through an array.